This session is on raising capital, and this is the second part of a two-part session. First, we had the founder's perspective, and now we're very fortunate to have the funder's perspective in terms of raising capital, and we're very grateful to have Julie Coles from IGAN Partners join us today. Thank you very much, Julie.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you, and please go ahead and introduce yourself, and we'd love to hear more about your background as well.
Okay, great. So, hi everyone. My name is Julie Coles. I'm an associate at IGAN Partners. Been with the firm for a little over 2 years now. Originally have more of a life sciences background, so always been very passionate about healthcare. Thought I would go to medical school, did an undergrad in biochemistry, quickly realized that the research environment, I know you love the research environment, was not a great fit for me. So I decided to go to business school, did my MBA. I always call that period of my life the opportunity to sample the healthcare system. So I worked for a little bit of time doing marketing for a major corporate medtech company. I also worked for Johnson & Johnson doing some pharmaceutical drug marketing. And then importantly, I worked in corporate strategy at a hospital in Toronto. During that time, that was when COVID hit, I got put in charge of project managing the implementation of virtual urgent care and the remote monitoring program, and really got interested in healthcare technology and saw firsthand how much opportunity there is for technology to solve a lot of the problems facing our healthcare system, but importantly also the barriers and the challenges and the realities of actually implementing that technology. It all sounds amazing and cool in theory, but there's some real challenges I think people have to be aware of. So that got my interest in health tech sort of kickstarted. When I graduated, thought that I would end up working for a health tech startup. That was the goal. Sort of stumbled into VC by accident. So my vague mission when I graduated from my MBA was I wanted to be a part of bringing healthcare innovation to the market. Assumed that the best way to do that would be to work for a healthcare innovation company, but ended up on the buy side of that. But I think the mission of IGAN Partners is still very aligned with my objectives, and so been with the firm ever since, and it's been a wild ride so far, but it's been really fun.
That's awesome. That's really great. And I think, it also speaks to the different career paths that you can have, both, in terms of undergraduate life sciences, but even as a physician as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure you also work with many physicians as well. So that's really great to hear. Tell us, just, really at the very basic level, what is venture capital? And you can also tell us a bit about IGAN as well.
Yeah, so IGAN Partners is a Toronto-based venture capital fund that specifically invests in medical technology and then also healthcare software. So really the only area of healthcare that we don't tend to invest in is we don't do therapeutics. We don't really invest in the molecules itself, but any technology that could hypothetically enable the drug discovery process, for example, would be within our wheelhouse. Typically focus on non-invasive medtech, healthcare software. We really don't discriminate within that thesis. And I would say a key part of our thesis is that we're early commercial stage investors. A lot of investors will define themselves as we are seed stage investors or Series A stage investors, but to be honest, everyone really defines those stages differently. So we always say that our sweet spot is early commercial. So on the healthcare side of things, we're really looking for companies that are close to, if not already hitting that 1 million in annual recurring revenue mark. And then on the medtech side of things, we're looking for companies that are very close to getting regulatory approval if that is relevant to them, or if not already generating some early revenues and having regulatory approval. That being said, we love to meet with companies years before that process, as we tend to track companies and build long-term relationships, which I'm happy to speak to later. But that is a little bit about IGAN. So we can technically invest globally, but majority of our investing is within North America. Even more specifically, I'd say about 90% of our portfolio is in Canada at the moment, but always looking to expand and explore new geographies as well. I guess venture capital as a broader definition. So if you're coming from the perspective of a startup company, venture capital at its core is really, our model is to raise funds from either high net worth individuals or institutional investors, which we would refer to as LPs. And then our job is really to allocate that private capital to various startups. And every venture capital fund will have its own thesis and its own sort of areas of focus. And then our model is really to invest in companies at the early stage, help them grow and face those early commercialization challenges. And then ideally we would sell that company several years later, generate a return, give some of that money back to our investors. The fund managers would take some of that money as well. So that's sort of the core business model behind venture capital. Every VC fund has a different thesis, as I mentioned, and also stage. So at IGAN Partners, we consider ourselves roughly Series A investors, early commercial investors. You'll run up against VC funds that invest at the pre-seed stage, commonly at the seed stage. Some VC funds will only invest at the B or the C stage. So you really just have to do your research on the venture fund that you're dealing with to understand what their sort of goals and priorities are. But at a core, I think that hopefully that's a okay definition.
Oh, that's very helpful. Thank you so much. And can you tell us about the different other sources of capital that, medical students or young entrepreneurs can be looking at in terms of funding their venture?
Yeah, absolutely. So usually when we think about options for sources of capital, you map it according to the stage of the company. So typically when you first start out, you might apply for research grants, government funding, academic institutions will often provide funding. So that's really when you're in that incubation stage of just sort of doing the research or getting a product together. And then once you take it to the point where you're maybe at the pre-seed stage, you've got a product or an idea for a product, and you're kind of at that point, you might raise from high net worth individuals, which are as described, or you might go out and raise money from angel investors, which tend to be wealthy people who are investing just off of their own balance sheet, or you might raise from friends and family. So you're sort of dealing with those early investors who are willing to sort of put capital in. They have some expectations around returns, obviously, but they don't necessarily work for an established coordinated fund that has usually they'll have their own thesis and priorities and expectations, but you're not quite dealing at the institutional level. And then usually around the seed stage, although sometimes there will be pre-seed institutional investors, you'll start to raise funds from institutional investors, so largely venture capital funds. Family offices are another form of investor that we will often co-invest alongside. Those are essentially high net worth families who will have a large balance sheet, and they're on a mission to sort of invest and generate returns for their own family and kind of grow their own balance sheet over time. And so family offices are another great source of capital, and they're typically willing to go a little bit earlier than venture capital. And then there's the VC stage, which I had mentioned, which really can range anywhere from the pre-seed, although more commonly seed, Series A, B, sometimes C, sometimes D. And then the lines get a little blurred as you get later on. Sometimes you will just exit the company before needing any later stage capital. Sometimes you'll raise money from a late stage venture fund, and sometimes you'll raise money from a private equity firm, which tends to invest in more mature companies that are really at that point where they've established a product market fit. They've really proven that they have a technology and there's a demand, and they've grown it substantially, and they're just raising to fuel that growth as quickly as possible.
That's very helpful. And can you walk us through the fundraising process from your perspective as a VC?
Yeah, absolutely. So the fundraising process from the perspective of a VC, and correct me if I'm not getting this perspective right, I'm going to go through my perspective of the fundraising process. So we will typically meet with a company. Oftentimes, as I had mentioned before, we really like to build relationships with companies over time. So oftentimes we'll be meeting with a company for the first time. We'll kind of do a preliminary pitch. Maybe we're meeting them in person at a conference or an event, or maybe we've had them come in through one of our deal flow channels. We get a preliminary pitch. Usually it's about 30 minutes long. They sort of explain the company and the business, and there's some interest there. And then if that company has sort of hit the investment thesis or the investment scope criteria for us, we might say this is a company that we're interested in. We're going to move into the due diligence process. So what that would look like is we would get an NDA signed with that company. We would request access to the data room, and we would come up with a diligence plan as investors for, at a high level, this company seems like it could be a good fit for our investment thesis. It seems interesting. It seems compelling. What are the areas that we need to check off in order to better understand the business and get more comfort over an investment decision? From there, I think every fund has their own process in terms of how long that takes, how deep they go. Being medtech investors, we definitely go very deep, especially on our medtech opportunities, because we're trying to validate the business case behind companies, which is quite a bit of effort, but also validate the technology and understand that it's safe, it's effective, it does what they claim it does, and that there's a clinical due diligence technical checklist that we need to check off. So those are the two kind of main cases that we're trying to build, and that process, to be honest, can span quite a bit of time. So ideally we would do sort of preliminary diligence. We would have a meeting with our senior partners. We would run them by the opportunity. We would make a decision as a team of, is this something that we want to invest in? If we do want to invest, what terms do we think would be appropriate? There would be a negotiation factor between the investors and the company, see if we can align on, mutual deal terms that work for both sides. If there is, we would issue a term sheet, which is a non-legally binding contract that summarizes the terms under which we're interested in investing. However, you can always sign a term sheet and then do further due diligence and then pull out of that investment decision. So I think understanding that this is a mutual agreement between the company and the investor is important, but also potentially subject to change. And then we would do what we call post-term sheet due diligence, which is really confirmatory due diligence. So prior to the term sheet, we're really building the business case. If we get comfort over the business case, we decide to proceed with an investment. Confirmatory due diligence is just making sure that all the checks and balances are in place. There's no major issues that we had missed, and just sort of confirming our decision. And then we would, proceed with closing the deal as well, which can sometimes take a considerable amount of time. So I know when companies always meet with us, one of the first question is, what is your timelines? And it's a really, really difficult thing to answer because it depends on the company. It depends on our capacity. It depends on their expectations around timelines. So it's a very intense process, I would say, from the perspective of the investor and also the company. And so we do our best to work within everyone's time constraints, and we do our best to limit the amount of work that the company has to do on the diligence side, and also the amount of work that we have to do on the diligence side before we can make investment decisions. But it really does kind of vary on the opportunity. So I hope that answers your question, and let me know if there's anything you want to dig into within that.
No, that's very helpful. I think the timeline thing is, something that comes up a lot because the cycle from kind of conceptualizing when you need to raise funds to when you actually have the funds can be quite considerable.
Yeah, and I will say, especially in this market as well, when we are dealing with fundraising, we always advise companies pick the time that you think you need to go to market with a fundraise, and then go out to market at least 6 months prior to that. Mm-hmm. It's just a really difficult funding environment, and everything is taking so much longer. And I think investors as well, in the medtech space specifically, there are so few investors relative to the number of deals that I think investors have a little bit more leverage. And so there's a bit of an understanding of there's not as much of a rush as you might see with some of these more SaaS-based software investors. I think there was a period of time, specifically in 2019, 2020, 2021, where the diligence process was shortened considerably, and there was a lot of money thrown into businesses that were maybe not getting thoroughly vetted. Mm-hmm. And so there's been a lot of downstream consequences for companies and also for funds in response to that. And so I think, as we've seen in 2022, 2023, and honestly probably more likely into 2024, that process has been extended considerably, and I would say even more so if you're a medtech company compared to a software company.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that you need a lot of patience during this process.
Yes.
I'm wondering if you can comment on how you interact with other funders, for example, during a round, and the timeline for that. So, in the session where we had the founder's perspective, we talked about, setting up a particular timeline when you say, well, I'm going to open the round and, it's going to be open for a certain amount of time. How do you sort of relate to other funders in that perspective?
Sorry, do you mean funders or founders?
Funders.
Funders. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. The funding environment, especially in the Toronto health tech or even North American health tech space, is a very close-knit community and a strong ecosystem, and everyone does talk and everybody knows everyone. So we love to collaborate with other funds on the due diligence process. It makes things easier for us. It's just sort of a shared resource between us and other funds. So that's very common. And I think another important point for IGAN, and something that we're also seeing with a lot of funds, is institutional investors, so being venture capital investors, but also private equity, they are increasingly cautious and don't want to be the only institutional investor in a company. Mm-hmm. I think especially for medtech, that's important because, and this is partly an unfortunate reality or circumstance surrounding COVID, but you never know if it could repeat itself, is a lot of medtech investors invested in companies prior to COVID. They had certain expectations around the timelines and the capital requirements that it would take to exit a company, which was be the ultimate goal. And then COVID stalled everything, and we had to sink a lot more money and time and capital into a lot of those companies than we would have anticipated. A lot of those companies are now, well-funded, and they're in a good spot now. But I think what we saw is there's a lot of crossover investors. So those being investors who don't typically invest in healthcare, but they got really excited by the buzz around healthcare in sort of 2019, 2020, started investing in healthcare. And then when the realities of COVID and the challenges of commercializing healthcare became apparent, they went running for the hills, and it was only the true healthcare investors and the medtech investors that were left to sort of pick up the pieces and support those companies. So we've seen a lot of venture funds are a lot more interested in investing either in syndicates where there are other institutional investors who are committed, or co-leading investment rounds with other institutional investors. So I think that's an important piece. And so it's sort of twofold. We like to collaborate with other funds and say, let's invest and share the due diligence responsibilities and help expedite timelines on that. And also let's kind of partner for life, because when you're investing in a med tech company, I was at an event earlier today and they referred to it as a marriage. It's not a short-term journey. And so you really want to be partnering with companies and with investors and with other investors who you're going to be able to work with and have a strong relationship and partner with for the long term. So that's an important factor as well.
Absolutely. And that theme comes up a lot in terms of, relating your professional relationships to personal relationships in many ways, both with your funders and your founders and co-founders and other members of the team. So I think those are very important points and considerations. I'm wondering, because, again, we're so fortunate to have your perspective here, if you can share sort of some key pieces of advice to, say, for example, medical students or trainees in science that are young entrepreneurs. What advice would you give them from the fundraising perspective as a VC? What are some things that you think should be very clear take-home messages? We like to see this, we don't like to see that. These are some things that you can think about. I think that would be very helpful for our listeners.
Sure. The number one piece of advice I would always give, and this does not necessarily relate to the pitch itself, it's the concept of relationship building over time. I think investors aren't always seen as humans, but we are human beings and we like to form relationships with people and we like to see our friends succeed. And I can't express the importance of having a pre-existing relationship with an investor, even if you're, years away from that investor actually being ready to put a check into the company. They might have a strong network of earlier stage investors who they like to share deal flow with, and B, they like to be able to benchmark your success and your progress over time, so that come time where you do kind of slip into their investment scope, they know you well. As I had said earlier, this is really a long-term partnership when you're investing in a company, and so VCs want to invest in companies where they know the founders. They the team composition is a really big part of the investment decision process. And so I think just establishing a relationship with investors over time is very important. Even when you do a pitch, let's say you do a pitch and the conclusion is that it's too early, get feedback from them, actually listen to that feedback, use that feedback to tailor your pitch in the future. And kind of, you're playing the long game, I guess is what I'm trying to get at. When it comes to the pitch itself, I would say always go into those conversations really understanding the investment thesis of the fund that you're pitching to. I can't tell you the number of times that companies have come into a pitch only to find out in the last 5 minutes of a 30 to 45 minute call that they're way too early for us, or they're a therapeutics company, we don't invest in therapeutics, etc. And so that doesn't necessarily have to mean that conversation was a waste of time or not worth having. It just means that there's an opportunity to kind of tailor the pitch up front according to what you're looking to get out of it. And so maybe you are out of scope for them, but maybe you want some advice. Maybe you are way too early, but you want to just get yourself on their radar, establish some milestones, get some feedback on your plan, and then start that relationship so that you can come back years later with some updates, and then, find a mutually beneficial time for you both to kind of partner up. This is a bit of a controversial one because I have heard the opposite opinion given, so take this with a grain of salt, but I find that companies tend to spend too much time establishing the problem statement. I think, everyone thinks that their company is super unique and they're solving a really unique problem, and so a lot of these clinicians will come in and spend 10 minutes establishing the problem, but to be honest, every med tech or healthcare investor worth their salt is probably already aware of the problem statement. So I really appreciate when companies come in and they say right off the bat, are you familiar with the problem? Do you want us to spend more time on it, or do you get it? And more often than not, I understand the problem and I've just been looking for the right solution. And so we can kind of skip to the more impactful components of the pitch. I think that's, probably it for now. I think also, like I said earlier, starting that fundraising process way earlier than you think you have to, especially in this market, because it will take some time. Being prepared with the data room also in advance, relating back to the relationship piece, a lot of the time you might establish a relationship with the investor, you really hit it off, you get a lot of excitement and momentum around it, and then they come back with all these questions and you're sort of scrambling at the last minute to find all the pieces that you need. So before you even kick off the fundraising process, just making sure you have a clean deck, you've practiced on people, you have the story kind of narrative ready to go, and then you have the data room to support it. One more piece of advice I would also say is that it's very natural and it's completely understandable for your pitching narrative to kind of evolve over time. I don't think the expectation should be around crafting this perfect pitch and then hitting the market with that pitch and not changing it. So my advice is always identify the partners who you are really keen to work with and identify the partners who you're maybe not so interested in working with. Start with the ones that you're not so interested in. Give them the pitch, get some feedback, see what resonates, see what doesn't resonate, and really refine your story and get it in a really good spot and get that data room ready as well, so that when you're ready for those conversations with the investors who you do think are a really good fit, you've kind of maximized the effectiveness of your pitch and you can kind of carry those lessons learned into those conversations.
Those are all really great points, I have to say, and I think very relatable to, clinicians. And one of the key things that, I've realized and that has come up in multiple sessions as well is the importance of, as you said, transitioning from, wearing the clinician hat to demonstrating that your problem and the solution to that problem can actually create a viable business with a substantial market that is investable. Yeah. And I think getting to those points are really important things to consider. Mm-hmm. Any final parting words to medical students or trainees with regards to the fundraising process and, just really some parting words that you'd want us to keep in mind?
I guess I would just say keep fighting the good fight. I mean, I think everyone...
It's a rough fight.
It is rough. I think the thing that's so fascinating and also infuriating about healthcare investing or being a company with a piece of healthcare technology is the technology is not the problem. The fact that we can, if you have enough money, you can book a first-class trip to space to go to space for the afternoon now, but we're still using fax and paper documentation in the healthcare system. Yes. Is kind of mind-blowing. So I think we're at the point now where everyone understands the technology is there. The healthcare system just tends to get in its own way a lot of the time. And so I think that anyone who is putting their time and their energy into navigating that is innovating. It's a very commendable thing to do, and it's not easy. And so, I would encourage people to keep doing things like that. I also think for physicians or clinicians who are interested in maybe going down this journey one day, it's a really good opportunity to just get involved in as many things as you can early on. I mean, I know, for example, you've joined our advisory board, which I think is fantastic. Even if you don't have a business at the moment or an idea right now, I think getting to understand the ecosystem, getting to know the people in it, establishing those relationships, understanding who's funding what and what everyone is looking at, and also getting some exposure to what are other companies out there, how are they innovating. Yes. Becoming a KOL for a company is a great opportunity to kind of see the realities and the challenges of commercializing healthcare technology, so that one day when you do have an idea of your own, you can kind of take some of those lessons learned and maybe set yourself up for success. So always kind of push yourself and try to get out there as early on as you can, because I think it'll definitely pay off in the long run.
Yeah, no, I think that's really great advice. And as you said, as physicians, we're also very uniquely poised to sort of understand many of these problems and can serve, as an extra voice in terms of opinions, vetting certain companies, maybe even being part of the diligence process in some ways, even if it's a company that we may or may not be related to. So mm-hmm. I agree. I think, that's been really great. So thank you so much. We really appreciate your advice and your feedback and you taking the time to join us. And it's been a really great session. So thank you again, Julie.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it as well. This has been fun.
Yeah, thank you.